What's going to elevate the Falcons offense more? Is it going to be better play calling or better execution?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So today's Locked On Falcons is, of course, an all-22 review of their Week 8 loss to the Miami Dolphins. We'll talk about, play calling. It'll be a less than passionate defense of Zac Robinson's play calling and why I tend to think that execution and getting better play out of some key positions is going to do more to help turn around this offense. We'll talk about JD Bertrand and Mike Hughes' struggles in this Dolphins game, as well as what schematic adjustments Jeff Ulbrich could potentially make in order to get this defense playing at an elite level once more. But if you do not know who I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this humble podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So when we talk about play calling versus execution, what was the bigger issue? I tend to lean more towards execution in this Dolphins game. To me, in a nutshell, the Falcons got thoroughly outplayed by the Dolphins. They certainly got out schemed and out coached as well. But, for the most part, especially when we're talking about the offense, the Falcons offense versus the Dolphins defense, I think it was more poor performance, particularly when it came to the run game, which we thought would have a sort of get right, bounce back, breakout game, whatever you want to call it, against a poor Dolphins run defense. And too often, particularly in the first half of this game, too many blown blocks, too many missed assignments. Ryan Newsel, Charlie Warner, Elijah Wilkinson were kind of the main culprits in the first half of this game. But obviously a lot of the blame has been directed at Zac Robinson, and, the fingers are being pointed at the reason why the Dolphins run defense was so much more effective against this Falcons run offense is because Zac Robinson's run attack is far too predictable. And, I understand where that comes from, but I think it's probably a little overblown. I think it's very easy for folks to tend to blame one person for a lot of the team's problems. I think what was fully on display in this Dolphins game, but I think people have a tendency to not be willing to accept this reality, is that the Falcons, just from a talent standpoint, are not as good as we think they are. They certainly have some very talented skill players, but in the trenches, they have not been as good as we would like them to be, particularly along the offensive line. And that has shown up in a number of their losses so far this season. Now, when it comes to Zac Robinson, he is absolutely a limited and flawed play caller, but I don't think those limitations and flaws are that much related to the predictability aspect. I think the biggest area of concern with Zac Robinson and his play calling, at least for me, is, the lack of play action in this offense, which contributes to the lack of explosiveness in this offense. But those are issues that aren't new to this offense. We spent, 7 months this offseason talking about that. We've seen we've noted a number of times on this podcast that a significant chunk of the explosive plays that they did generate last year, and the explosiveness in the offense was very hit and miss, but a lot of it was just basically due to Darnell Mooney, playing well above at least a certain humble podcaster's expectations last year. And now he's kind of come back down to earth this year in a lot of ways, and has been basically a non-factor through 7 games up to this point. And it does feel like, for me, the bigger issue is not the predictability of the Falcons offense from a scheming standpoint from Zac Robinson. It has been, you've seen a step back at a number of positions. Now, quarterback we'll circle back to, but wide receiver, I think, definitely is one, and offensive line is another one that we've talked about. And some of that is owed to Caleb McGarry's injury and again going into the season. Now, I think again in this Dolphins game, you saw the wide receiver and offensive line play struggle, right? Wide receivers weren't able to separate, the blocking wasn't as good as some of the worst we've seen from the Falcons in a long time. The worst we've seen so far this year. And I feel like those things have more to do with the Dolphins loss than the poor play calling. Now, if you can get better play out of this wide receiver core, as well as this offensive line, I think it'll do wonders to at least, improve this offense, whether it's going to mean, the Falcons going to score 30 plus points every single week, like, a lot of people hope and want to see, that remains to be seen, but it'll at least allow you to get a much more consistent, competitive performance than what we have seen far too often this year. Now, when it comes to the quarterback position, depending on what metric you can use, like you can certainly make an argument in a case for Michael Penix being an upgrade over Kirk Cousins. The real issue, I think, with Penix, that was less of an issue with Kirk, although it was still an issue with Kirk, is the variance, right? And what I mean by that is you have a much more higher highs with Penix, arguably, but much lower lows, right? Essentially, when you look at some of the metrics, Penix is basically a top 10 quarterback when it comes to playing at home this season, but is basically a bottom 5 quarterback when the Falcons play on the road. And then you compare that to Kirk Cousins. Certainly, when you look at him through this point in the season, through the first 8 weeks of the season, he was actually below average at home, and, was like top 10 when it came to efficiency on the road. And then obviously in the latter half of the season, starting around week 10, you saw a significant step back from Kirk in the back half of the season and that whole thing. But, I think you're hoping for, with Michael Penix, the opposite to be true, that in the latter half of the season, you're going to see a big step up for Penix. And that to me is going to be able to allow this team to hopefully, get closer to whatever their goal is, winning record, playoffs, all that stuff. And we'll see if that, and you're just kind of hoping that the Falcons can kind of maintain Penix's top 10 play at home. And you just kind of get closer to league average, as far as the road stuff. And that was very similar to Matt Ryan's rookie year, where he started out very poorly on the road. And then as the season wore on, got closer to league average. And when it comes to Zac Robinson, I think particularly when you look at the Bills and Washington game, there have been significant signs of improvement overall, but unfortunately it's been 2 out of 7 games, and you do the math on it, that's nearly about 30% of the Falcons games so far. And then the other 70%, I don't think it's been bad, but it's been much more met or okay, right? And then when you sort of do that math for the 10 remaining games the Falcons have, right, if that same ratio holds, well, we're only going to get 3 more well-called games from Zac Robinson the rest of the year. And that numbers, I don't think, is good enough for the Falcons to reach their goals. You kind of need that number to be, 5, 6 games. Again, more than that, we would love to see, but I don't know how realistic that's going to be based off of what we know about Zac Robinson at this point in time. And so if you can get that, and the Falcons can win all of those games, those 5 or 6 games, and then hopefully you can kind of steal a game or two, a win in any of the other games where you're just kind of getting met or okay play calling because of the defense or other elements, stepping up. That's going to allow the Falcons to kind of reach their goals. So, I didn't intend to come out of today's podcast and express optimism, but when I look at this Miami game, I think some of the reasons why, we look at this as devastating and the last 48 hours, have been, I've spent, and I'm sure some of you also can attest to this, have been much more negative, even from my standards, like far more reactionary and negative towards this loss, because I think by and large, despite the reasons for optimism, the reason for a turnaround, losing this Dolphins game in the way that they lost it is kind of a devastating blow, and kind of shattering those hopes for that sort of improvement / turnaround. And we'll see. So, as I said on yesterday's episode, it's going to take a lot for the Falcons to win me back. And I'm sure many of you as well. And we'll see if the offense can kind of figure itself out in the coming weeks. But let's turn our attention to the defense, which I thought took a step back against the Dolphins. And a lot of that step back might be to blame on two particular players in J.D. Bertrand and Mike Hughes, who were kind of liabilities in coverage. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, Mazda crafts cars for those who do more than simply move, whether we're talking about footwork all the way to breath work. Athletes, we know, sweat all the details, and Mazda brings that same intention to how we craft every model. Feel the Japanese craftsmanship in every detail, from metallic accents to available Napa leather upholstery. And you can make everyday drives feel like anything but, with smooth handling all the way to intuitive controls. And with all-wheel drive standard in every crossover SUV, you can drive with confidence through almost any season. So like our players, we sweat every detail, because when you make every move count, impossible becomes irrelevant. Mazda, move and be moved. And today's episode is also brought to you by Game Time. With the NFL season back, you want to get back into the stadium. I know it's going to be tough, but maybe you're going to be chomping at the bit to get back into MBS after the Falcons go on this 2-game road stand. And if you're looking for an opportunity, a place to go to get back in the stadium that's going to take the hassle out of buying tickets, Game Time is the perfect place for you, right? The beauty of Game Time is what you see is what you get, whether we're talking about the panoramic seat views, that you can look at before you buy, or, all the fees being included. So the price you see is the price you pay, and Game Time is going to allow you to take the guesswork out of buying tickets. All you got to do, download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. And as we know, at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, $20 can go a long way when it comes to concessions. So make sure you download the Game Time app. Again, terms apply. Redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. So obviously the Dolphins had a very efficient day throwing the football. 77% completion rate from Tua Tagovailoa, almost nearly 8 yards per attempt, almost 140 quarterback rating, 46% success rate. And a lot of that came at the expense of both J.D. Bertrand and Mike Hughes. Bertrand was mainly in the first half. Hughes was more the culprit in the second half. Based off of my charting of the Falcons defense, Hughes was targeted 9 times, gave up 7 catches, 113 yards, 1 touchdown, and a 67% success rate allowed when targeted. J.D. Bertrand was targeted 8 times, gave up 6 catches, 54 yards, 2 touchdowns, and had a 75% success rate allowed when targeted. And as you guys well know, you ideally want that success rate to be below like 45%. And so when you look at the combined numbers for those two guys alone, 17 targets combined, 13 catches allowed, 187 yards, 3 touchdowns, 71% success rate allowed. And so when you do the math, it's over 60% of Miami's targets and catches came against those two. Over 90% of their yards and successes came against those two. And 75% of their touchdowns came against those two. Now, my charting may not necessarily be the same that you see elsewhere. And there are 2 particular plays that I charted as Bertrand being the culprit that may not have been the case. And that's one of the challenges of, you're kind of making educated guesses on what's happening on the field. But the first play was the 3-yard touchdown to Devon Achane at the end of the first quarter. That was Miami's first touchdown. I charted the Falcons being in quarters coverage, cover 4. The slot receiver ran a sort of quick sort of spot route inside. Bertrand traveled with him, right? And that left the flat wide open for Achane to leak out the backfield. And Caden Ellis obviously could not make up the ground. And it led to a wide open touchdown. And I feel like that was a blown assignment on J.D. Bertrand that should have stayed at home in the flat and passed off the inside number 2 wide receiver, I believe it was Nick Westbrook-Akine, to Caden Ellis over the middle of the field. And then the second play was the third down right before the Dolphins field goal. That was the play that Bertrand nearly picked off the pass, but the Falcons brought a 6-man overload pressure on that play. And once again, Miami leaked Achane out on a screen pass. Nobody covered him. He was wide open, and it would have been a walk-in touchdown had the pass not been tipped by Caden Ellis at the line. And I'm assuming that J.D. Bertrand was supposed to pick up Achane on that particular play. I have no idea if that's the case. It could have been Jesse Bates. It could have been somebody else. But clearly someone blew an assignment, and you're not supposed to have a wide open wide receiver or running back in this case in the red zone on that particular play. So those are two plays that I attributed mental errors to JD Bertrand's. That may not be the case, but mental errors were kind of the theme with Bertrand's play in this game, particularly, in run support as well, especially in the first half. I thought he really struggled against the run, just consistently late reacting to plays, trying to read plays instead of being that sort of attacking and shooting gaps like you want the linebackers to be in this scheme. It led to offensive linemen because, you could see the wheels turning in his head. It led to offensive linemen being able to climb to the second level, take him out. And because Bertrand is already a smaller guy, he's not going to be able to get off blocks as effectively as bigger linebackers could be. And, it was late filling gaps, late, in pursuit and all these various things. And so, a player like JD Bertrand, because he doesn't necessarily have, ideal measurables and elite athleticism or anything, like he's got to be a player that has to win from the neck up to offset the limitations he has from the neck down, right? And he did not do that. And so we'll see if the Falcons, bench him for that reason and put in Josh Woods or Ronnie Harrison, who maybe bring a little bit more from both the neck up and particularly the neck down than Bertrand does. If they don't necessarily bench Bertrand, I could definitely see a situation where the Falcons start to enact some of the borrow a page from Ryan Nielsen and be like, let's enact some of these landman rules with him, which is let's play a lot of dime defense in obvious passing situations. We did see the Falcons unveil their dime, I believe, for the first time this season on one particular play in the third quarter. It was the AJ Terrell pass interference. And, we could definitely see the team because of the concerns about Bertrand and coverage, decide in obvious passing situations, primarily third downs and first and second and very long, where they go with 6 DBs instead of, four D linemen, 1 linebacker, and 6 DBs in that situation. Now, if they do that, hopefully that will address some of the coverage issues, but it doesn't necessarily solve the run defensive issues particularly on early downs. We saw the Falcons run defense step up in the second half of the game, too little too late at that point, but they did allow a 69% success rate to the Dolphins on the ground in the first half. That improved to a 38% success rate allowed in the second half. Part of the reason why they were able to play better in the second half, they utilized a little bit more big nickel in penny fronts. Big nickel being where you have 3 safeties and 2 corners instead of 3 corners and 2 safeties. And penny fronts refer to that 5-1 front where you have 3 interior D linemen, 2 edge rushers, and 1 off-ball linebacker behind them. Ronnie Harrison was acting as that sort of box safety hybrid linebacker in their big nickel. We thought, we saw DeMarco Hellams do that last week in that 49ers game. Thought it wound up him, but it wound up being Ronnie Harrison. And so, one option could be playing more penny fronts on early downs to help beef up against the run, where instead of having, as the Falcons typically have done they've operated penny fronts, they move Caden Ellis down to the edge and then have, whether it's Divine Diablo or now JD Bertrand as the single off-ball linebacker. I would personally like to see, if they're going to do that, is those situations on early downs, you play nickel, you play with your penny front, and you have Ellis as the off-ball linebacker, and then you have Arnold Ebiketie as the edge rusher because he's, until Jalen Walker returns, and we'll see if that's the case this week. Ebiketie is your best run defending edge rusher, and so I would like to see more of that style if the Falcons do decide, leaning into the penny fronts is the way to go. Another tweak I would suggest to the lineup is, let's get LaKale London activated. Let's get both him and Sam Roberts active at the same time in the same game and playing together. And those are your 2 beefiest run defending D tackles at this point, in addition to Zach Harrison, which, his absence was probably also a contributing factor to why the Falcons struggled so much stopping the run. And to me, I would probably dial back David Onyemata snaps in order to increase LaKale London snaps in addition to Sam Roberts. And it's not because Onyemata is playing poorly or anything like that, but as I've said many times this offseason and through the season, a big element of this current season is trying to figure out, how stocked is the cupboard from a young talent standpoint, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. And Onyemata, while not necessarily, if we're using the cupboard analogy, is not as a can of food that hasn't quite expired because it's canned goods and it lasts for a very long time. But you're looking at the date and you're like, oh, I bought this before COVID. This has been in the back of the cupboard for a very long time, and you're looking at some other items that are maybe a little fresher, maybe only a few months old, or a few weeks or whatever, and you're like, oh, let's push this Anyamata can to the back and let's crack open this other can to see what that's about. And we'll see if the Falcons do that in order to figure out, if Laquelle London, if Sam Roberts, if some of these other young D tackles are going to be core elements moving forward. So we'll see on that front. We'll end it here before moving on to talk about Hughes in the coverage. But my most controversial take is like part of that conversation of how stocked is the cupboard is like I would continue to play JD Bertrand snaps. Now, playing him 99% of the snaps like he did against the Dolphins is probably not a winning strategy, but I think you want to see if you can develop your young players. We marvel at how great a job Barrett Ruud and Mike Rutenberg and Jeff Ulbrich have done with Divine Diablo. It's like, well, do it with JD Bertrand. Again, not expecting JD Bertrand to play like Divine Diablo, but if you're good at developing players, you should be able to get better play out of him than what we saw this past Sunday. But we'll leave the JD Bertrand conversation aside. We'll talk more about Mike Hughes, as well as some coverage tweaks that I think the Falcons can make to get them back on track to being one of the better defenses in the NFL.
I'm Cody Rourke from Locked On Broncos, and this episode is brought to you by Peloton. Peloton is shaping the future of fitness with the brand new Peloton Cross-Training Tread Plus, powered by Peloton IQ. This is Peloton's most advanced equipment yet, giving you real-time guidance and endless ways to move, whether you're running, lifting, or you're cross-training with your favorite instructors like Alex Toussaint. It's training reimagined to make your workout more personal. Peloton is built for breakthroughs with features that help you plan, stay motivated, and hit peak performance. You can let yourself run, lift, flex, and go while Peloton handles all the rest. Plus, Peloton IQ provides real-time strength coaching, tracking your progress and suggesting weights that challenge you so you can get stronger. Plus, the new movement tracking camera, it counts your reps and corrects your form in real time, making sure every rep is safer and smarter. So let yourself run, lift, flex, push, and go. Explore the new Peloton Cross-Training Tread Plus at onepeloton.com.
So, like I said earlier, it wasn't a great day for Mike Hughes. They really took advantage of him when he was lined up against Jalen Waddle. 5 of the 9 targets I charted that Hughes gave up were against Waddle. 4 of the 7 catches he gave up were to Waddle. And that doesn't even count the play that didn't count. That got nullified due to pass interference penalty against Waddle. And so obviously the Dolphins really exploited that mismatch. Hindsight being 2020, as it always is, I think the Falcons can probably look back at this strategy and be like, yeah, we probably should have had AJ Terrell shadowing Jalen Waddle in this game. And I also think the Falcons probably should have played more man coverage in hindsight. Based off my charting, Miami's success rate against the Falcons man coverage was only 17%. They were only successful on 1 of 6 plays that the Falcons played man coverage. It was that 20-yard touchdown early in the fourth quarter on the screen pass to Ollie Gordon, where Jesse Bates got injured and got blocked on that particular play. That was their only successful play against the Falcons man coverage. And I think had the Falcons done that, it would have not only helped keep Waddle in check, because I think AJ Terrell would have been a far better matchup against them. It probably would have also allowed the Falcons to dial up more pressure. You go back to last week against the 49ers, and one of the factors that led to that loss, I think, was the 49ers had good answers against the Falcons blitz. We talked about how they had a 60% success rate against the Falcons blitz. I believe I looked it up afterward, and the Bills had like a 30% success rate against the Falcons blitz, which was a big part of why the Falcons blitz was so effective against them. Miami was much more like Buffalo when the Falcons blitz. They only had a 25% success rate when the Falcons blitz, but unfortunately the Falcons only blitzed on about 26% of their plays, which is the lowest blitz rate that I have charted so far this season. And this has been a consistent theme this year, that their Falcons defensive superpower is their blitzing. That when you look at the Falcons blitz rate in their 4 losses combined, it's been about 35%. In their 3 wins, it's about 47%. And again, there's a variety of factors that go into that, but it does feel like this defense and this team plays much better when they can really get after the quarterback. And again, what the scoreboard looks like when, it changes all that stuff. But, if I'm, consulting Jeff Ulbrich, and again, I know there are people in that building that are everydayers of this podcast, I would say, Jeff, you got to lean into the blitz, right? Again, I'm not saying you got to go out there and be Wink Martindale and blitzing every single down or anything like that. But, this team is struggling to generate pressure, particularly when they're in their base defense. And that matters because Miami, like San Francisco, were able to get the Falcons, particularly in early downs, in their base defense due to their heavy personnel, utilizing fullbacks and tight ends. And then the Dolphins case, a sixth offensive lineman to basically function as a tight end. Shout out to Falcons legend Daniel Brunskill, former college tight end. That, if you were an everydayer of this podcast way back in 2017, we were like, hey, this Brunskill guy's got a bright future. And 8 years later, he's contributing to Falcons losses as part of that revenge. If only the Falcons had done the right thing and kept them the whole time. But I digress. Y'all sit here. sorry we're going to stage. But y'all sit here and complain about the TJ Watt pick, and I sit here and go back. The Falcons should have never let Daniel Brunskill go back in 2017. That's what I'm losing sleep over. But basically by utilizing those heavy personnel packages on early downs, it is really doing a great job keeping the Wolves at bay because the Falcons don't really blitz when they're in their base defense, right? And then you couple that with the Falcons playing a lot more cover 3 in this Dolphins game, as well as the previous 2 games against the Bills and 49ers. I think that's also contributing to the problem. Now, the cover 3 was effective against the Bills. San Francisco and Miami kind of carved it up a little bit. And that's been a typical sort of trend when it comes to Kyle Shanahan's offenses, Mike McDaniel's offense, which is derivative of a Kyle Shanahan offense. It's also part of the Sean McVay coaching tree, which Zac Robinson is. And you guys may recall us talking about during the offseason, some of the better games that Zac Robinson and his offense had came against Tampa Bay and Carolina and other teams that play a lot of cover 3. And a lot of those cover 3 targets in this specific game came against Mike Hughes and JD Bertrand. Cover 3 is much more of a Raheem thing than it is a Jeff Ulbrich thing, based off of how Jeff Ulbrich called his defense with Robert Saleh back in New York. They were much more of a cover 4 as their kind of preferred zone coverage versus Raheem, which is much more of a cover 3. I would like to see them be a little bit more Ulbrich-y, if you understand, and being a little bit more reliant on that quarters or cover 4 as their preferred zone coverage. But it's not as simple as like, oh, well, if you just run more cover 4, it's going to automatically lead to greater success, right? A lot of variables, matchups, down and distance. In theory, if you do want to blitz, in theory, again, whether it's actually true or not, it's easier to bring pressure from a cover 3 than it is cover 4, just because in cover 3, it's a 3 deep coverage with 4 guys underneath if you're rushing 4, and then you can bring one of those second level defenders as a blitzer, and you still have 3 guys to cover the intermediate level of the field. But in cover 4, it's because it's 4 deep. And you bring, 3 underneath, you bring one of those, you only have 2 intermediate defenders to deal with that. And so you are a little bit more vulnerable. So that's one of the reasons why teams typically veer more towards cover 4 and longer down the distance than cover 3 and all that stuff. So it's not so cut and dry, but I do think there are lessons to learn from this loss for the Falcons defense. I think, the base defense sort of hurting you is a big one. You're not getting enough effective pressure and even though the Falcons are rushing 5 often when they're in their base defense, because they have 3 down D linemen and 2 edge rushers, and all of those guys are rushing, but because they're not able to really pin their ears back, because primarily that base defense is being featured on 1st and 10, a neutral down and distance. And so they're kind of like, well, we got to also gear up for the run, and particularly in this Dolphins game when Miami is running the ball so effectively, that really challenges that. But the problem is when the Falcons, whether it's a 4-man rush or a 5-man rush out of their base defense, they're not really generating any pressure. Based off my charting the last 2 games, they've generated 23% pressure rate when they've been in base defense on passing downs. And for those of you we've talked before about how, the quote unquote acceptable pressure rate is 35%. And for those of you that are everydayers, also that when I chart pressure, I tend to be a lot more generous with what I consider a pressure than websites like PFF or Next Gen Stats do. So that 23% is well below the 35% of acceptable level. And that number is probably higher than what those other websites would be. And so it may be in the teens or even lower than that, based off of what those sites chart as what is pressure. So you couple that with also not being able to stop the run on early downs. You're not generating pressure on those early downs, particularly when you're in base. It's leading to offenses dictating a lot more at you, and they're able to dictate more rather than you being the aggressor. And we want to see this defense getting back to being the aggressor and challenging offenses. And then when that's the case on those early downs where you can't stop the run, you can't generate pressure, particularly against the pass, you're really reliant on the secondary and coverage to make up the difference. And so you want to play more man or match coverage to kind of squeeze those windows that will lead to guys on the back end, breaking up more passes and whatnot. You want to press more because we've seen the last 2 weeks against San Francisco and Miami, a lot of quick throws, especially against Miami, where that was really like pretty much Tua getting the ball out. You want to press those guys at the line of scrimmage, try to disrupt the timing of those quicker throws and whatnot. And so hopefully we'll see AJ Terrell shadowing Stephon Diggs this upcoming week against New England, and then probably the week after that against the Colts against Michael Pittman Jr. Obviously the defense is not the Falcons' biggest issue compared to the offense, but it has been a little bit more lackluster as of late. And I think some of that is personnel related with the Bertrand and Hughes issues that have been a bigger issue the last 2 week games in particular. But I do think there are several schematic tweaks that can hopefully resolve some of these issues. And so, that is going to do it for us here on our All 22 review. We'll be back tomorrow with a crossover Thursday with Locked On Patriots. But if you wanted to, rather than hearing about all these plays, you want to see some of these plays we're talking about, whether we're talking about the run game woes, some of the struggles of Mike Hughes and JD Bertrand, as well as maybe putting a reel together of some of the previous games and some of the coverage adjustments that I'm suggesting, because there wasn't a lot of examples of it from this Dolphins game specifically. Why not become a Locked On Falcons insider? You can do so at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. And you get a 14-day free trial. And then it's $4.99 a month thereafter, in addition to access to the extended All 22 review, where you can actually look at the film that I'm talking about. You also, get to ask questions and get my live reactions on game day and all that stuff and more. So that is all available for you at the link in the description below. So check it out at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. Again, we'll be back tomorrow with a crossover Thursday. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, of course, go check out Locked On NFL to get the skinny on, what's going on elsewhere around the NFL. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every